V-E-T-S. What's her name? Vel. V-E-T-S. Okay, and what is she? Okay, got it. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Kennedy Center. My name is Jeff Ringer. I'm the director of the center. It's a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for our Book of the Semester panel on Greg Mortenson's book, 3 Cups of Tea. We'll have a little more to say about that in just a minute, but let me make a few announcements before we have a prayer and formally begin the proceedings this afternoon. I'll draw your attention to a lecture this Friday in the Kennedy Center, Friday, 16 October at 2 o'clock in this room. Andriy Nahachusky, who is the chair of Ukrainian Culture and Ethnography and director of the Ukrainian Folklore Center at the University of Alberta, is here on campus as a guest of the university and will be speaking on political skirmishes in Ukrainian and Russian culture. So we invite you here, particularly if you have an interest in that area of the world, Friday at 2 o'clock. Also want to draw your attention to the upcoming Economic Self-Reliance Conference. This will be the 12th annual Self-Reliance Conference. It will be sponsored, it is always sponsored by the BYU Center for Economic Self-Reliance and will be held the 5th and 6th of November in the BYU Conference Center. So please mark that on your calendar as well. Well, let's begin today's proceedings as we always do with a prayer. We've invited Lilia Velbovets, a graduate student in public relations from Ukraine, to offer the invocation, after which I'll introduce the panelists.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this wonderful day, thankful for all thy blessings, and specifically for the opportunity to have an education and have a better understanding of other cultures and of how we can help other people and be a better service. We ask you please help us so that during this panel we can touch the subjects that are of a great importance and have a greater understanding of them and help us establish opportunity for sharing the gospel and also for sharing the compassion throughout the world. And we ask you to please bless those that are in need and need your gospel. And we ask these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Lilia. Several years ago at the Kennedy Center, we decided to re-inaugurate an idea that the honors department here on campus had pushed for a number of years, and that was the university-wide Book of the Semester program. At the Kennedy Center, we decided that each year, each fall and winter semester, we would choose a book that we thought addressed an important global topic and had widespread appeal. And we're very pleased with the success we've had over the last several years, and especially pleased that this semester we've chosen 3 Cups of Tea, a book that many of you are familiar with, authored by Greg Mortenson and David Relin. Greg Mortenson, as you know probably, became involved in a roundabout way in building schools for girls in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, and it's a wonderful story. And Mr. Mortenson will be joining us here on campus in 2 weeks for a forum. We are partnering with the University Forum this semester. He'll be speaking on the 27th of October at the regular forum time, 11 a.m. in the Marriott Center. We hope you can all be there. We've also made it a practice of hosting a panel prior to the arrival of the author to discuss the book, to prepare us for the author's visit, and to get some views from our own campus faculty and family on what this book has to offer. So I'm pleased today to have these 4 panelists with us. Let me introduce them briefly. And following the introductions, they each have a few remarks that they've prepared. We'll begin with Sister Samuelson and go from your right to left, right on down. Following that, we'll take questions. Our first panelist today is Sister Sharon Samuelson, who, in addition, of course, to being the wife of President Samuelson, is also an early reader and advocate of this book. She read it several years ago as part of a book club, I believe, and was a supporter of bringing Greg Mortenson here to campus. We're very appreciative of her being with us today. Following Sister Samuelson, we'll hear Next, from Spencer Magleby. Professor Magleby is the Associate Dean in the College of Engineering. You may know that the College of Engineering has been very aggressive in their international outreach in the last couple of years. Has been a real advocate of globalizing their own program and, by extension, globalizing campus. So we appreciate Professor Magleby being here. Following him, we'll hear from Joan Dixon. Professor Dixon is an associate both with the International Development Program hosted here at the Kennedy Center and also the Center for Economic Self-Reliance at the Marriott School. She is one of our top practitioners of development here on campus, and we're grateful she's here. Finally, we'll hear from Professor Eric Eliason, College of Humanities English Department, who, in addition to the perspective he brings as a professor of English, is also a member of the Army Reserve and has had several tours of duty in the area that the book discusses and has some on-site experience to share with us today. So we welcome each of the panelists and invite them now. They're going to just remain seated with their mic from where they are, so we'll just invite each of them to spend between 5 and 10 minutes delivering their prepared remarks, and following that, we'll open up to questions from the audience. Sister Samuelson.
Brothers and sisters, it's a pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon and talk about 3 cups of tea. I believe my qualifications, as Brother Ringer said, for being on this panel is that I love to read. I think books can be friends. They can be means to take you to places you'll never visit. I'll probably never, ever be in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, but I feel I know these areas a little better by reading the book. And that's why I love to read, because they teach you so much and they can change one's lives by what you read in those books. I first read 3 Cups of Tea about 2 years ago in my book club. We just happened to pick that book. Someone liked it. And so it wasn't the book to read at the time that we read this book, but we all really enjoyed that book. In fact, we were so touched by it that we collected money in our book club to send to the CAI, the Institute, and we put a little postscript in the little note we sent to him. And we're not sure if Greg Mortensen ever really saw the note, but we said, please tell your wife, Tara, that we really admire her, sympathize with her, the life that you are putting her through, you know, what the worry that you're causing her to have and so forth, that we really admire her. The second reading was to prepare for this panel, and I read it more carefully and studied it more deeply. I think that ever since 9/11 that we can't have a day go by that we don't read in the newspaper or we don't see on the television or hear on the radio something about Pakistan or Afghanistan. And most everything that we hear is the negative, the killings, the bombings. There was just a big bombing in Pakistan the other day. The insurgencies, the hatred, the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, that's what we hear about. We really don't hear about the schools being built or the doctors going to that part of the world to help. We don't hear about the women being educated. We don't hear about the water projects that are completed, the health centers, the women's centers, these things being built. And all these projects Greg Mortensen has had a hand in. And I'm sure there are other people doing the same thing, but he has touched so many lives that through the projects that he has been involved in. But we don't hear about that. That's why I think it's so important that this book is going around, and we know that I've been told that it's being read by the military. It's required reading at universities. The word is getting around that there are other things going on in this part of the world. As I read this book, I thought of some of the life lessons that I could learn from reading the book. One of them is, we know that Greg Mortensen had a failure experience. He so wanted to climb K2, but he and some others helped save the life of one of his fellow climbers, and thus he was not able to complete the climb because he had run out of stamina. He just couldn't do it. And so coming down the mountain, he gets lost, not once, but twice, which tells a little bit about him. I think that he sometimes is naive and didn't follow some of the rules or pay attention to things he should have. But sometimes in our lives, in our own lives, we have failures and we have disappointments. And just as Greg Mortensen's failure and disappointment took him on a completely different path that he never expected to be living or having anything to do with, I feel like that can happen in our lives, and it's happened in mine. So sometimes those failure experiences and disappointments can lead us to something maybe even better and bless our lives. So I kind of learned that from this book. The other lesson that you learn from it, and I know that each one of you here believes this because you're in the Kennedy Center, is that one person can make a difference. There's so many times you may hear about problems or some situations and you think, well, really, what could I do? I'm just one person. But Greg Mortensen didn't think about that when he had the vision and the desire to build a school in Corfe. He didn't think, well, I'm just one person. I can't do this. He knew he wanted to do it, and he set about doing it. And he was not a wealthy man. He was not a famous man. He didn't have financial resources. He didn't have any connections to people back in America. But that didn't stop him. He had a desire and a passion to educate children, especially girls, in this part of the world. And so he went ahead and did it. And he was not without his own flaws. He was naive. If you read the book, you know he was naive. He lacked judgment in certain things. He did not think some problems through. He was disorganized. His own family says he was always late. And when the CAI was organized, they got so frustrated with him because he didn't contact them. And so I would think he's probably an individual that would be pretty frustrating to work with at times. But they all respected his passion for what he wanted to do. But he had traits that I think really are lacking in much of the world today, in politics, in the business world. He had traits such as being honest. He had integrity. He was honest. He wanted to serve others, and he didn't try to serve others by having the attitude of what is there in it for me. He just loved the people that he wanted to serve. He wanted to educate these young people in this part of the world because he felt that it was through education that he could bless their lives. He could somehow be able to stop some of the terrorism. If there's any way he could stop a young man or a young woman from being caught up in the madrasas and being taught to go on jihads and to be suicide bombers, if he could just help any young man or young woman stop that, he was helping the world, and he was helping to combat terrorism. I thought of President Hinckley when he stressed so much to the youth of the church to be educated. Didn't have to be a university education or a college education, some kind of a skill, because it would better their families and it would better their lives. I love to read. I have stressed so much to my children and to my grandchildren the importance of reading and the importance of learning to serve others. And I was very happy, and I don't know if you are aware of this. You may have younger brothers or sisters or cousins and so forth. You could give the books, but there are 2 new books out that just came out in March. One of them is a young reader's edition of 3 Cups of Tea. One man's journey to change the world, one child at a time. And this would be a great companion to the adult book because it has a glossary in the back. It has a timeline of what happens in Greg Mortensen's life, and it has some new pictures in it. And also there's a child's book called Listen to the Wind. And the illustrations in this book are just wonderful. They're all as if it were a collage, and it's told from the point of view of the children in Corfe, of a Dr. Greg coming to their village and building them a school. And it's called Listen to the Wind because if you recall, when he is with Haji Ali, looking over Haji Ali's wife's grave, and he says to Greg, one of these days you're going to be standing over my grave. And Greg did not like that at all, and he says, what will I do without you? And Haji Ali says to him, just listen to the wind. And so when Greg was standing over his grave, he remembered him telling him to listen to the wind, and he listened, and what he heard were the children's voices. And so he knew this is what he had to. I didn't think I'd cry, but it's so touching that he loved the children so much. And I am so looking forward to him coming and to listen to his story. We know that everything wasn't perfect there. He's not a perfect man. And he had his struggles, but we know what he's done, and he has touched the lives of so many young men and young women and children and I so appreciate reading and learning more about him.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I hope there's some pictures that I can send to my mother. I told her that I was on this book panel review, and she was floored. She has 4 boys and no girls, and we're all engineers, and this has always been a point of consternation for her that there's no culture in the family. So that I've advanced to actually read a book. I'm going to talk about it. That's been pretty big. And so I'm moving up with my mother. I love reading biographies, and I consider this, among other things, a biography. I love to see what people do in certain situations. I love to find behaviors that maybe I'd like to match up with, or how they handled some kind of thing. And oftentimes you find things you don't want to do. And there's a mixture of all those kinds of things in here. And so there's a lot of threads through here, but I kind of relate a little bit to Greg Mortensen. I love to build things. One disappointment I had in the book is that there's no diagrams of the school or anything to look at, you know.
Just the pictures.
Yeah, just the pictures. So that would have been fun for me. But the idea of conceiving of something and working with people to construct something that will be of value has always been something that's enticed me, and so I like that a lot. I also see in the book a lot of what I'd call a kind of a tipping point, that you bring someone in like a Greg Mortensen, and working with other people and the nature of their surroundings, he's able to do a lot, not just because of himself, but he gathers a lot of people around him that enable this to happen. We often talk about one person can make a difference, which I truly believe in. And as we look at education, our college, we advocate that a lot, that you can change the world. But most really great change comes through your ability to influence others or work with them. And he brings a lot of people into his sphere, and they're ready to do something also. So he changes the world, but he enables other people to do that also. And there's an opportunity for us to do that. He brings in a set of characteristics or traits into this that allows this to happen that are pretty unique. I'm not sure how many of us would be able to collect those. He has kind of an open world upbringing, not the kind of upbringing I had, although I was raised in a very nice home. Not this same kind of thing. And this teaches him how to engage with a variety of people. Perhaps we could all value that. He's very bright. And he uses that brightness, right, to understand languages. He knows how to organize things that he's seen his parents do. Goes back to his father and his mother doing similar things to what he did. He knows something about construction. He knows something about medicine. And this education allows him to move forward in ways that less prepared people perhaps would not. And I relate this to our college students and to students in our college, right? Be prepared. You'll never know when the door will open. You never know when you stumble down from K2 and show up in a little village. But if this had been a different person that had stumbled in there, even if he was passionate, he may not have been able to pull this off. He's athletic and gifted, and he takes advantage of that. That's a nice thing. He's engaging. As Sister Samuelson says, he's naive, almost childlike. He's like a big kid. I can totally relate to people that I've met that I think, man, they're so compelling, but you just think they need to grow up in a way. But he uses it into his advantage and to the advantage of people around him. He's persistent, maybe even obsessive on some things. He's open to others, and he knows how to listen and learn. What a great characteristic to combine with this natural gifts of athleticism and being bright. Right? He's open to others. Oftentimes when people are bright and educated, they shut other people off. And there's a trait that we need to pick up here, one thing that makes him successful. And this all leads to him being enabled and supported. And in the end, he does make a great difference with the help of a lot of people. I always like to try and see, well, what can I learn from things like this for me? One thing that I really took away from this was the idea that I need to be respectful and listen, even in situations where maybe it seems like I would know more than the other person. This is hard for a professor to imagine, but this could be a great thing to do. So if you can combine the idea that you are capable, but that you're open and willing to listen and that you're respectful, which he is on every turn, at least in the book there, that's a terrific thing. I also learned that we should support good government. He's operating in a vacuum in these countries. It's terrible. I don't think we appreciate what we have. In fact, it's his ability to operate from a base like the United States that, also does some things that aren't so great, but it's that infrastructure and ability that allows a lot of these things to happen. So we should be respectful of good government and promote it at every possible turn. I also was interested in his marriage. As I read biographies, you often find that great men have some suffering wife at home. His wife has some ability to persist that's unknown to me. How she stays with him is pretty amazing. And I wonder about that, and I think about that. I don't really have an answer for it. But oftentimes to achieve greatness, a lot of other people have to step forward and be willing to sacrifice, and they often stay in the shadows. We should all learn from that. Greg Mortenson's the front guy, but my gosh, there's a big group back there. It reminded me of that little Verizon commercial, we look at the one guy and he's got the millions of views. Okay. But I did really like the book, and I learned a lot from it. It makes me think about things and how we might interact in the world. And as we have programs where we interact with other people, we send our students out, how should we be and what would we like to promote? In the end, my heart strings were tugged at from the needs of these people, and I was hopeful that perhaps there's some ways to step forward and be great neighbors and loving brothers and sisters. So.
Thanks, Spencer. Joan?
Thanks. I really enjoyed this book, and I'm amazed at, like Spencer was describing, just the capabilities of Greg Mortenson and what he was able to do, and the ability of one person to make a difference. But I think as I was thinking about what I would comment today, I really want to talk about more than just Greg Mortenson, because the amazing thing to me is he's not the only person in the world doing things like this. And it's wonderful for all of the silent, probably millions of people who are doing these kinds of things, that every now and again the story of one of them gets told, and it becomes a bestseller, and everyone starts to know about it. But that one person changing the world can't do it. It has to be millions of people changing the world. And each time the success of one person is published, it inspires more people to do things like that. I thought I would just share a few numbers with you of people doing things like this. There's a book that came out in 2004 called How to Change the World by David Bornstein, and he was documenting the increase in the number of NGOs, organizations like Greg Mortenson's CAI, Central Asia Institute, people who are starting NGOs. So just for example, he says, 20 years ago, Indonesia had one independent environmental organization. Today it has more than 2,000. In Bangladesh, most of the country's development work is handled by 20,000 NGOs, all of them started by individual people working together like Greg Mortenson. India has well over 1 million citizen organizations. Slovakia, a tiny country, more than 12,000. Between 1988 and 1995, 100,000 citizen groups opened shop in the former communist countries of Central Europe. In France, during the 1990s, an average of 70,000 new citizen groups were established each year. In Canada, the number of registered citizens groups has grown by 50% since 1987, reaching 200,000. In the United States, between 1989 and 98, the number of public service groups registered with the Internal Revenue Service jumped from 464,000 to 734,000, a 60% increase. Some estimates say there's 1 million groups in Brazil and 2 million in the United States. And during the 1990s, the numbers of registered international citizens organizations increased from 6,000 to 26,000. There's a huge social movement going on. It's a silent revolution that never makes it into the media. We're seeing all of the wars and the politicians and all of these things happening, but as Sister Samuelson said, we don't hear the stories of the schools that are being built, the women's groups that are happening there. But they're there, and they're important, and they're growing, and books like this bring that awareness a little bit closer to the public's awareness. The same thing's happening here at BYU. When I first came back to BYU, the students would come and say, "Oh, we're starting an NGO," and I'm like, "You're 20 years old. What do you mean you're starting an NGO? This is hard work. You can't do this." And yet, the next week, another student would show up starting, there are so many people here on this campus that finally I said, I'm not going to discourage them. I'm not going to discourage the next Greg Mortensen who's naively and blindly going to go off to some place in the world and make a difference, because that really is the way things are getting done. And when millions of people across the earth begin to do these kinds of things, it will make a difference. Just a few statistics that I've been able to count up here at BYU. We have an international development minor, which we hope attracts people with these kind of inclinations. We have nearly 150 students who are officially registered in it, and I've got an email list of over 700 students who have expressed interest in this kind of things. I've managed to identify over 120 faculty who are working in some kind of an area related to international development, doing a wide variety of things. And these numbers are growing. We were just over at the major fair, meeting new students who are coming and saying, I'm looking for a major. What is this? And I say, oh, it's for people who want to save the world. And they're like, that's what I want to do. And so it's growing. There is a live movement here. I'm excited to see how many people show up at that forum assembly in 2 weeks and the responses and reaction, because I think the seeds are here for this kind of work that's going on. I wanted to touch on a few things that I gleaned from this book that I think are useful to the kinds of students we have on our campus that are doing development work. And the first one of those is the importance of sacrifice. I think sometimes as I was reflecting on this book, I started looking at it like a piece of literature and was thinking of all of the themes of life and rebirth and different things. And I had to keep reminding myself, this is a real person, and this is what life is really about. But it really shows the essence of what it means to lose your life in order to gain it. He had that amazing experience in the mountains of nearly dying and then being brought back to life by those people in those villages and seeing the world in a totally different light, and then going back and changing everything he did. He could no longer be the same person. And I thought it wasn't an easy thing. He had to sacrifice a lot of things. But in reality, not just his time and his money. He gave up his house. He lived in his car. He did a lot of things to sacrifice to figure out what this new life was going to be about. I liked the one little section in the book when he was getting ready. He'd finally gotten enough money and basically sold every single thing that he had to make that first trip to go and build the school. And that as he took his climbing gear out of the storage, that represented his former life, and how it seemed like such the drive to go from the storage shed to the place where he was selling those was like driving away from his life and everything that he'd planned up to that point and embarking totally on something new, that he got rid of all those possessions. It was a very symbolic act, but part of that process of being committed to this kind of change in the world is to literally be the change you want to be. You have to give up certain things and expectations about yourself. And people around you will probably think you're crazy. And yet, following that inspiration and going with that is an important piece of it. Another part that I wanted to talk about, and Sister Samuelson brought this up as well, is failure and the importance of failure. That he learned a lot of things from failure. In my own work, doing development work, I found that failure is often one of my best teachers. Nobody's gone before us. We're inventing things as we go along. Trial and error is a good teacher. It's a hard teacher, and it's embarrassing, it's frustrating, it's difficult. But sometimes the only way to learn something is to screw it up and then figure out what went wrong, and that's when the real path opens up. And I think over and over again in his life, he illustrates that point of he gets to the end and goes, I thought I had the solution and I didn't. I can't go on. He was so discouraged, and yet it was trying to do something and doing the wrong thing that put him in the point where he could do the right thing. I just want to illustrate this with one experience I had. I was working in Nepal doing workshops with a group of people from NGOs that were doing literacy. And we started our workshop by asking everyone to tell about their programs. And each person stood up and talked and said, here's what we've succeeded, here's where we're working, here's what we're trying to do. And about halfway through, one of the men stood up and he said, I could give a report just like everyone else has been giving, but I really feel that I need to be truthful, and I want to tell you that our program isn't working. We are struggling to teach people to read and write, and our main problem is that the textbooks are in Nepali language and the people don't speak those language, and frankly, our program's a failure. As soon as he said that, as soon as he admitted that they were having failure, every single person in the room said, we have the same problem. And it totally opened up for us to have an honest, working workshop to understand and begin to get at what were the real problems, what were the real things they needed, and not to pretend we were doing things well. And one of the problems that we face in development is people, in order to get funding from donors, you always have to give a nice report and say, yes, we did this very well. And remember the part in the book where he's come back, he didn't get the school built, he doesn't have money now, he's got to find money for the bridge, and he doesn't dare face his donor who had written that little note, don't screw up. And here he was, he screwed up, he's got to start over. And I thought that quote where Dr. Louis Reichert, one of the people who had first scaled K2, calls him on the phone, and he says, pull yourself together, Greg. Of course you've hit a few speed bumps, but what you're trying to do is much more difficult than climbing K2. Coming from Lou Reichert, those words meant a lot, Mortensen said. He was one of my heroes. Lou Reichert knew something about suffering for and reaching difficult goals. His acknowledgement of how tough a path Mortensen was trying to walk made Mortensen feel that he hadn't failed. He just hadn't completed the climb yet. Call Gene and tell him everything you told me, Reichert said. Ask him to pay for the bridge. Believe me, he can afford it. Mortensen felt for the first time since coming home a semblance of his old self. He hung up and rifled through the Ziploc bag that served as his address book until he found the scrap of graph paper with Herney's name and number. Don't screw up, the paper said. Well, maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. It depended on who you talked to. And I think that is so typical. I find that this kind of work is more difficult than anything. Most of the institutions and jobs and things we do in this world sort of have the path laid out, and there's lots of people working on them. But in the world of development, people are making the path as they go along. I remember once being in a workshop, and the consultant who was helping us says, looks to me like you're trying to build your airplane as you fly it. And we all kind of looked at each other and went, yeah. And think of the dangers of doing things like that, but sometimes that's the only way you can do it. But a failure isn't a failure if you learn from it. A failure isn't a failure if you talk to someone who helps you put it into perspective. If you admit you didn't work and go back to the donor and say, here's what happened, here's what I learned, will you still fund? And of course the guy gave him the money and was willing to go on. I think failure is an important principle of our gospel, too. It's central to the plan of salvation. Otherwise, why would we have the atonement and repentance, which are so critical to that? We're expected to learn through failure, and it's a critical piece. And I think one of the things we can thank Greg Mortensen and David Relland for in terms of recording his experience was they recorded those failures in vivid detail so that we can feel for them and be frightened by them, but we can also take comfort and learn from them as we go forward. The last quality that I picked up from this is exactly that, this perseverance, the endure to the end, the willing to keep trying to find a different way. I often have students when they're looking for internships say, well, I want to go with a good NGO, a good group that knows what they're doing, or how do I identify which one's good? Or this past summer, one of the students came back and had not had a very good experience because of some problems with the local NGO. And she goes, are all of them like this, or is this just one of the bad ones? And as I think about it, I honestly have to say, I would guess every NGO I've ever known has its failures, has its bad times. And I've ceased to be judgmental in terms of, oh, don't go with that one, they blew it, or they did this thing wrong. My criteria for this work is if someone is willing to learn from their mistakes and go on, I know they will come out a stronger organization in the long run. And so I'm willing to work with them and bet for them. And even as I'm advising interns to say, it's okay if things are not going well. Help them figure out how to do those solutions, because failure and learning from failure and that struggle to continue is so important. The final thing I want to, well, two more things. One is, the thing that's amazing is here's this naive guy who's going along and doesn't he makes all these mistakes, and yet he does figure out what I would consider to be the basic principles of development. And one of the most key is the ability to listen to and work with the people and collaborate with them. And there was a great little story when he's talking to Haji Ali, who was his mentor, and he's learning to listen to him. Haji Ali asks him, "Where are you going to build the next school?" And he goes, "Well, I thought I'd travel off to the Hush Valley and visit a few villages." And Haji Ali interrupts him and says, "Can I give you some advice?" And he goes, "Sure." He goes, "Why don't you just leave it to us? I'll call a meeting of all the elders in the Braldo and see what village is ready to donate free land and labor for a school. That way you don't have to flap all over Balitsan like a crow again, eating here and there." So once again, this is what Greg says, once again, an illiterate old Balti taught a Westerner how to go about developing his backward area. Ever since then, with all the schools I've built, says Mortensen, I've remembered Haji Ali's advice and expanded slowly from village to village and valley to valley, going where we've already built relationships instead of trying to hopscotch to places where I had no contacts. I think this key principle, listening to the local people, I've worked a lot with adult literacy programs. I find illiterate rural women are so wise and insightful that you have to listen and understand. And when we listen to them and then have a dialogue with them and bring together the resources we have to connect with the knowledge and resources they have, then we truly find the pathways and the solution that bring us to good kind of development. So, anyway.
Thanks, Joan. Eric?
Well, it's an honor to be here, and really an honor to listen to what everybody had to say about this book. And I appreciate these insights, and I think I won't try to reduplicate too much of what was said, which I agree with. But I think the reason I'm here is as a second witness of some of the issues that are taking place in this part of the world. And in 2004, I served with the 1st Battalion of the 19th Special Forces in the Utah Army National Guard as their chaplain. And we were deployed to the Kunar province in Afghanistan, right up along the border of Pakistan, not too far away from where Greg Mortensen is doing his work. And part of the philosophy of the Special Forces as a very small part of the United States military is to understand and live with the locals, with the understanding that the basic cornerstone of any development that can happen starts with providing security for the people. If their lives are disrupted by terrorists who are killing them and blowing them up, anything else that you might try to do for them is going to be destroyed by that, or not even be able to get off the ground to begin with. And so that's something that we very much had in mind. But the Special Forces likes to do it in a way very much that understands the local culture and the local ways of doing things. They're the experts at training locals to provide for their own security. A team of 12 Special Forces guys can train up a battalion of locals. And that's what I was involved in doing, and the guys I was involved with there. As a matter of fact, in both Afghanistan and Iraq, this way of doing things has started to influence the rest of the United States military. Not nearly fast enough, according to my opinion. There's a lot of guys still sitting in tanks, which are useless, and pretty much in both of these wars right now. But one of the things I was able to do was work very closely in doing some development work in Afghanistan with people very much like the Balts. The Baltis. In my case, it was ethnic Pashtuns in the Pesh Valley. So I just wanted to share some experiences I had along those lines, and just reaffirm some of the principles of good development practice that have been talked about by the other panelists here. Before I arrived there was an American civil affairs officer who had given $500,000 to a village elder to build a medical clinic. That village elder, that $500,000, and that medical clinic have not been seen since that time. I mean, and that's I mean, that's a old school development thinking 101 of big projects, labor intensive, requiring expertise from outsiders rather than the locals, that just don't work anymore, and we know that. One of the things I really appreciated about this book was its title. It turns the focus not on Greg Mortenson's experience, which we hear plenty about, but that there is nothing wrong with this part of the world that can't be fixed with what's right about this part of the world. That the skill sets, the attitudes that local people develop are the ones that are going to be able to help them better than anybody, no matter how smart they are, no matter how well-intended they are, who shows up and presumes to tell them how they can live better lives. The locals themselves can know better, and the best we can hope to be is facilitators in that process of understanding. As a matter of fact, this is a picture of schoolgirls in the Pesh Valley in Afghanistan. This was taken at the girls' school there by a U.S. News and World Report photographer who was embedded with us. And Afghanistan is a country that's, I think, exaggeratedly estimated to be 30% literate, and certainly in rural parts of the country that's even more so. But they were learning Pashto poetry the day that we visited. And this was something that they did on their own. The school teachers at this school in Afghanistan had previously just been teaching boys. And they hadn't been teaching girls for two reasons. One is that there wasn't enough prosperity in that area to have the girls be taught as well. The second reason is if the Taliban were still around, the people involved in teaching the girls and the girls going to school would have been killed. And that's something that we saw. There was a lot of stories about people that I knew had experienced that. But because we were there, they felt on their own that this is something that they wanted to do. And they just wanted us to come by to visit the school, so that the teachers asked us to do this, so that the girls would know that men with guns were there to protect them in going to school, not to be a threat to them. Because on their experience before, that's all that they had seen. Those guys with guns were there to be a threat. And so this is something that we didn't even do. It's like we were pleased and like, oh, this is great. We're glad that you're doing it. We brought pictures of our own daughters and said, this is my daughter. She's about your age. She's in school too. Now the other side of the story, I mean, in development work, things can get complicated and morally ambiguous in some ways. The reason why they could all afford to go to school is because of the copious profits they were making from the opium production there in the valley. And since people were getting wealthier from that, they had the excess cash to be able to send their kids to school. Nobody felt really particularly good about this, though, and opium addiction because heroin addiction has become more and more of a problem in Afghanistan because of this. But that's part of the lay of the land. Well, another story I wanted to tell you too that hits on some of the themes that Greg Mortenson talks about. This is a picture of me and my friend Masiula. And I was the chaplain for this unit and for the 1st Battalion of the 19th Special Forces, whose main mission is to train infantry soldiers. And one of the soldiers told me, hey, we have a guy in our Afghan security forces who is trained as a mullah, and he's looked to as the spiritual leader of our Afghan security forces guys. He leads the call to prayer, he does all this kind of stuff for him. We're here training the rest of these guys to be infantrymen. Why don't you train him to be a chaplain? And so I put together a little program of instruction on what it takes to be a chaplain, what chaplains do in visiting soldiers and things like that. And I explained to Masiula that it doesn't matter whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, doesn't matter. A lot of things what a chaplain does in the military in terms of providing for the spiritual welfare of the soldiers is all the same. Would you be interested in learning about this? And he was like, absolutely. He was just way excited about this. And this is us getting ready to go visit an observation post on the surrounding hilltops where we had all around where our fire base was. We had observation posts on all the hilltops all around. And one of the things the chaplain does is go and find, you spend a lot of your time with the main body of the troops, but you also go and find the soldiers. Where are they sitting in a foxhole? Where are they getting rained on? Where are their rations not as good? And find the soldiers who are suffering and in hardship and go to them. And so that's something we went to do together. And as I got to know Massiola more, I learned some interesting and surprising things about him. He was revered as an educated guy because he had been to a madrasa, a religious school in Pakistan, and he was a hafiz, which means he can recite the whole Quran in Arabic from memory, which is a particularly impressive feat in the case of Massiola, since he didn't speak a word of Arabic. But they learned how to sing it at this madrasa. And along with the learning each surah, there's a commentary that they were also learning in Pashtun that was an exegesis of the Quranic text. But that was something that was really neat and very impressive. But so assuming that he was an educated guy, because of this, I proposed some other things that he might want to think about as far as working with the soldiers. Maybe he might want to set up a literacy program where the soldiers could be, the Afghan soldiers could be taught how to read. The translator said, yes, this sounds very interesting, but nothing ever happened really with that. And it wasn't until later that I figured out that the translator didn't tell me that Massiola was illiterate. Just because you can recite the Quran from memory doesn't necessarily mean that you can read Pashtun. And so I let the thing lie because I didn't want him to feel bad about that or think that I thought anything less of him because of this. But it also told me a little bit of something about what the nature of the education was that he was getting in this madrasa that was being funded by wealthy Gulf state Arabs in the kind of Wahhabi Islam that Massiola, that Greg Mortensen talks about. That he'd been there for 10 years and hadn't learned how to read. Took me a while to get my mind around that this is what was being considered education. And so Greg Mortensen picked up on that, and there's a different kind of education that's going on in an alternate school system in this part of the world. There's the madrasas, and they're competing with schools that teach people literacy. At the end of the day, the parents are going to decide what is going to be more beneficial to the children. I mean, we can get all geopolitical on this and talk about cutting off the spigot of Gulf state money to these madrasas or something like that. But at the end of the day, none of that's going to matter. What's going to matter is what parents on the ground really see as what are likely to be the advantages for their children. There was no shortage of students at the village school that had been set up by the villagers themselves that was teaching the kids literacy in Pashtun. That opportunity wasn't there when Massiola was a young man. But one of the things that's interesting to me about Massiola too is that he, when he was in his madrasa in Pakistan, one of the things they taught him, well, other than to be a hafiz, was that the Americans were crusaders there to come to destroy Islam and to do bad and terrible things to the people of Afghanistan. But as Massiola and I worked together as we developed a mosque reconstruction project that I may tell you about here in a little bit, he began to feel differently about this. And one day he had some leave time accumulated, and he disappeared. And we didn't know what had happened to him, and we're actually, frankly, kind of worried because he would have been seen as a high-value target for the other side in the conflict of somebody who they might want to disappear and get rid of because as a collaborator. But at the time, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were leaving what's called night letters in the village, where they make these propaganda claims about what the Americans are here to do and the terrible things that they were doing. But those weren't getting a lot of traction because of the reconstruction work in the mosques that were being reconstructed while we were there. But what turns out what Massiola had done is he had gone back to his madrasa in Pakistan to talk to his instructors and he said, look, the Americans aren't what you say they were. When we go out on patrol with the American soldiers and it's time to pray, they stop and we get to pray. They care about our religious heritage as seen in their mosque reconstruction. They're not out to destroy Islam. As a matter of fact, they're teaching us a new idea, is that it's better to live a religion that you've freely chosen to take upon yourself rather than one that's been forced down your throat. And in the end, isn't that something that's a lot more powerful as a way to live your religious life? He said, his teacher, I don't believe this. Nothing in my experience leads me to believe that's what Americans are like. He said, well, Masula said, well, then come to the Pesh Valley and see what is happening. Witness for yourself, like I have, what's happening there, and you'll see that things are different. I'd love to tell you that story is being reproduced all over the world where American soldiers are trying to do this kind of work, but you guys can read the news as well as I have. And I would have been very surprised. I was in Afghanistan in 2004, and then in 2009, this 2004 was when the Abu Ghraib scandal hit, and when the al-Sadr's Shiite uprising was happening in Iraq. And if you were to tell me that Iraq was winding up in what can really only be described as a positive way, maybe it's a long time coming and maybe it was too costly, those are different issues that I won't get into, but it's wrapping up in a positive way. And Afghanistan seems to be the problem area. We would have been very surprised to think that that was actually what was happening. The idea in this part of the world, and the Baltis are very similar to the Pashtuns in that the idea of hospitality isn't just an important value, but it's the most important value. They would read the story of Lot in the Bible offering his daughters to the Sodomites to preserve his guests, the angels. They would see that as a terrible story, heart-wrenching indeed, about the worst thing that could happen to somebody. But they would see that Lot was doing the right thing. What was the most important value there was, is to be that kind of hospitable to people. And that's a powerful cultural thing to tap into. And I think Greg Mortensen does a really interesting job in that. Just one final thing, though, in talking about the mosque reconstruction project. Here's a picture, and one of the things I like about this picture is, do you see any Americans here working on this new archway for the new door to the compound of the mosque? No, it's all local Afghans, local artisans doing it in the way that is consistent with their cultural values, with their aesthetic preferences as far as how the architecture should be, and that was very much on purpose. And one of the things that we tried to do in starting this mosque project too was not come there with the idea that you are benighted primitives and we have a better way of doing things that we can show you, which never really impresses people very much, or like, oh, we're rich folks who have a whole bunch of money and we want to shower some of that on you because it'll make your life better. That people don't like that easily. So the way we tried to frame this whole thing, and this only works if it's absolutely sincere, was I would sit down with the village elder and I would say, look, twice now in the 20th century, Afghans and Americans have stood shoulder to shoulder to face the most dire threat on the planet that there is to human freedom. 20 years ago, that was the Soviet Union. And because of Afghans and that war being fought here, that was what led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Now the biggest threat is, and again I would quote what they would say, I would say it's these parasites who give Islam a bad name by being terrorists. And those were words that I picked up from the way they talked about it and would use those words to describe the situation. These guys are the biggest threat to world peace now. And here we are again, Americans and Afghans standing together to fight this. But I realize that this war is being largely fought in your country. And as Americans, we are enjoying security and peace has largely been won at the expense of sacrifices Afghans have made. And as we want to do something to show our appreciation for that. And we know that your religion is important to you. Mosques are not just cultural buildings, but they're also places where that are community centers and schools. And we would like to help do something if there's some improvements that you would like to be done with the mosque. And again, they would direct how it should be done. Maybe the American would look at this mosque and think that it needed indoor plumbing. There's not a lot of indoor plumbing, I don't think, anywhere in Kunar province in Afghanistan. And so their priorities of what might be the most important thing that mosque need might be something different. And we would work out a deal that a certain amount of money would be paid for certain specific items of work that would be done. And we told them, and when we would present them with half of the money up front and say, this is what we've all agreed on, and all of the village elders would be there, and sometimes other taggers on would be there. And we want everybody to see that this is how much money is being given for this project. This is half of the money up front. The other half will be given when it's completed. If there is more money, if there's money left over, we don't want any of that back. We want to see more stuff than you agreed to done on the mosque. Say we didn't agree to doing windows with this amount of money, but if there's money left over, go ahead and do that. And sometimes they would say stuff like, "Well, hey, could you guys bring in some workers to do this?" Or we would like you to. It's like, "Oh no, we're not going to do anything. This is something you guys can do, and we can help fund some of it. You guys are the village elders. If there's more workers that are needed, find them." And I'd turn to the mullah and say, maybe this is a good topic for your next sermon in the mosque, is the need for some volunteers to work on this. And he'd say, okay. And then so the volunteers came forward to help work on this. And again, it was something that gave them ownership of the project. It was something it turned it away from being something that was condescending Americans with their good ideas telling them what to do, and became something that it was a symbol of cooperation and the rebuilding and the reemergence of their culture and their country on their own terms. Very different, I like to think, than the civil affairs story that I told you of the guy with $500,000 and wanting to build a clinic that never happened. And we said that the way that you can most impress us is by doing this with the least amount of money. So the more reconstruction you can get with the less money, the better. And they soon were competing to see how efficient they could be. And village elders from villages all around were lined up to get this. And this wasn't a part that I was involved in because I was a non-combatant. But the commander understood that this could very easily be turned into something that was worked against us. I mean, maybe you've seen the David Lean movie Bridge on the River Kwai, where the British prisoner of war in a Japanese prison camp builds this magnificent bridge in Burma, in the Burma theater in World War II. And at the last minute, he has this realization that everything that he's been doing as to instill discipline and esprit de corps and a reason to live for his troops has served the enemy as he tries to stop the special operations team that's come to blow up his bridge. And he realizes that oh my gosh, everything I've been done is to serve the other side here. And I worried about that a little bit, but I don't think it came to pass, and for several reasons. One is that one of the things that the commander wanted to see was evidence of cooperation with the Afghan security forces and the rebuilding of Afghanistan. And again, stuff that I wasn't privy to because this wasn't my job. Intelligence, arms caches, things like that started to pour in, and what the priorities were as far as which villages got mosque reconstruction went that way. Also, very much too, that as I did this, I read Woodworth, I'd read Muhammad Yunus, I knew a little bit about the principles of NGO work, and this is something that I tried to inculcate in the way that we did this work. And as soon as the locals could take over the work and the village elders could be empowered to do this, that was even better than us being seen as the people who did it. Well, anyway, those are just some reflections from my experience in that part of the world, and it was quite an experience.
Thanks very much. Would you all join me in thanking the panelists today? Now, I know a few of you have commitments at the hour, and understand that, but for the rest of us, we want to stay around, just ask a few questions, and I'd like to take advantage of my position and ask the first couple of questions. I want to start with a question for Professor Magleby. A general question, actually. The College of Engineering has been so aggressive in promoting its efforts to internationalize curriculum programs for the students. I wonder if you could take a minute and explain why. Why do you consider that so fundamentally important for what you're doing with your students?
Well, we have a number of things we're pursuing. So the idea of understanding a global context for being productive internationally is linked to leadership also. If we're going to be producing students that can change the world and can be leaders, we need to get them out of Provo and see what needs are of other people. So some of the things that I saw in here, I think, have a direct bearing where somebody that goes out is fairly capable, but instead listens and then works with the people there. And we would like to promote that kind of a feeling. We would like to be less ethnocentric and more feeling that there's things to be contributed by everyone around us. So we'd like to get a highly educated person and a very capable person, but one that is going to then realize the strengths of others around them wherever they might be in the world. So, yeah, we're looking for this kind of global impact from our students.
Thanks. A question, I'd like Sister Samuelson to start with this one. There are general themes in the book, but the specific application is with educational efforts among young women. Can you speak to that? What difference you think that makes? Why that particular educational effort is so important?
I'd love to. Greg Mortensen himself says that in educating a young boy, he usually leaves his home and goes away. But if you educate a young woman, she is going to stay in that village, and therefore she is going to want her children to be educated and will be influenced the whole village by her education. Also, when I read this, I did a little bit of reading that young men, when they have to go on a jihad, have to get permission from their mother. And if you have a woman that has been educated and does not want that violence in her life, she will not give her son permission to do this. And Greg Mortensen also says that the first thing that a mother will ask a daughter that is educated is to write her family, this is her mother's family, extended family, a letter. Because in those villages, often when the mother gets married, maybe in another village or moves to another village, the contact is gone with her family. And if she can get her daughter to write a letter to her mother, in other words, to the daughter's grandmother, she's got that feeling of having contact with her family, her extended family. And also, Greg Mortensen said when they're selling in a market somewhere and things come wrapped in a newspaper, the mother will say to her daughter that knows how to read me this newspaper. And so if you can get the young women to be educated, then it seems to have even more influence than the young man.
Joan, any thoughts on that from your own work in literacy?
Oh, I got so caught up listening, I wasn't thinking about it. It was striking me as so often as women marry, they move to different villages and they take that experience with them. And just the idea of letters and connecting people and genealogies and the records of things. I think one of the things I like to add is I think we need more women's groups with adult literacy for women instead of just doing the young girls and helping the women to learn to write themselves. But they are in all development work, with whether it's microcredit loans or whatever. Women focus on what's going to help the whole family, and they put their investments into the education of their children. They invest the money into feeding and clothing and the health care, and so they are important people to educate and to support.
Thanks. I know the hour's getting late, but I want to take a few questions from anyone in the audience who may. We've got Ralph Brown right up here.
Can I just add to that?
Please, go ahead, Ralph.
So the A number one variable in terms of increasing GDP over time in a country is educating young women. As you educate a young woman and her age of first pregnancy goes up, so they have their first babies later in life. They have fewer babies, and it shifts from a production economy at home to an economy that young women are mobile, they go get jobs, and it's absolutely incalculable how many different ways educating a girl is different from educating a boy in the developing world. And so if you want to put any kind of money anywhere or any kind of emphasis anywhere, you educate a girl. And they're diametrically opposed as to what the outcomes are in terms of you're going to invest in education in that regard.
Thanks, Ralph. Please. Wait for the mic for just a second, would you? Thanks.
I was just wondering if any of you can touch on the wider security implications of educating women. It seems like Sister Samuelson has kind of touched on it, like the having to get permission from his mother before he joined the jihad. But I was wondering if there are other, would this have an effect on radicalism in the area or anything else?
Eric, any thoughts on that?
Gee, I don't know. That's a good question. Mothers in Palestine are giving lots of free permission to their sons to blow up Israelis, and they're some of the most educated.
I think
certainly compared to people in Afghanistan or Pakistan, they're a lot more educated.
The woman who was here last week, Ashe, from Somalia, is probably a wonderful example of that. She's organized. In Somalia, there's 5 clans that basically do all of the decisions for security in the country, and she, working with the women's group, has organized the 6th clan, and they've actually gotten representation for all Somali women from all of the clans to work together. And basically they said, we're sick of this civil war, we're tired of our children not having food and everyone being killed, and we want peace. And by working through all the clans, they are able to promote that. And also Valerie Hudson's recent research that shows the relationship between domestic violence and as a predictor for national level violence, that countries that oppress and don't give opportunities to women have severe problems. And I think one of the reasons, sometimes when we're trying to build up women, we tend to downplay men and say, well, let's not educate the men because they don't do anything useful with their education. I think we're living in a world that has been structured with certain kinds of resources that we educate the men into behaving a certain way. And women, as outsiders to that, getting education, are thinking in different terms of supporting the family and the community and the social kinds of things. And so they make different decisions. And I think those are the kinds of things that in the long run will transform the way we think about organizing the world and getting things done. That there's, instead of training men up to be powerful leaders and military kinds of people, we're training both sexes to participate in a more collaborative way. And so they're all interconnected.
Let me just endorse one of the things Professor Dixon said about Valerie Hudson's research project, the Woman Stats Project, which we're happy to host here at the Kennedy Center. She has a great website, womanstats.org, where she goes into some of this research she's done and her findings, and it's really remarkable stuff. So let me encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I just wondered because I've read in the New York Times that the Taliban have especially targeted girls' schools, and I'm guessing that's because they feel particularly threatened by educated women. And so I was just wondering if, kind of building off what you guys said, would an increase in female literacy and male literacy kind of lessen the grip of the Taliban in these areas?
That's what Greg Mortensen hopes and believes that it can. And when you look at this, you have to say, how much courage would I really have to live in this part of the country when you're threatened if you're going to send your daughters to the schools, and the Taliban would threaten them that they've attacked some schools. You know, I sometimes put myself and think, how much courage would I have to send my daughters off to be educated? Would I be able to do that? But that's his hope and his belief that it can. I mean, it remains to be seen. There's a lot of violence and hatred in that part of the world, and but we can hope.
Thanks. Other questions? Anything else? We have time for about one more. Yes, please.
I was touched by Haji Ali when he brought the 12 rams and gave them to the bad guy, that he said that was comparable to half the wealth of the village. But he could see long term what it would be worth, and he did it with a smile. And in support of that also, Brigham Young was once asked what he thought about educating his children. He said, I would much rather, it's more important to me to have my daughters educated than my sons, because of the ramifications of when they come back to our families and our communities, they will strengthen things over time. And a good example of that was Ellis Shipp. He sent a lot of young students to the East to get their education in arts and sciences, and Ellis chose to become a doctor, and she came back and delivered many, many babies. Was a wonderful influence in the early pioneer communities, and that's just a great example. I think things like this will happen in that part of the world too.
My wife's grandfather went to work so his sister could be educated, and that the family only had those means to do that, and the daughters being educated was more of a priority. I don't know how common that was, but it's impressive.
On that note, let me also suggest we all take a look at Elder Carmack's recent responses. Elder Carmack, as you may know, has been the executive director of the Perpetual Education Fund, and he's been asked repeatedly if the Perpetual Education Fund also applied to women. He was asked that so often that he ended up giving a talk on that, in which he essentially said education for women is not Plan B. Education for women is like education for men. It's Plan A. So in our own context, it was a very interesting talk to read. Thank you for being here. Thanks again to our panelists. We'll hope to see you at the forum on the 27th.